In the rolling hills and dense forests of Missouri in 1835, a secluded homestead lay hidden along a winding dirt road, far from the nearest town. The Smith family, ordinary by most measures, lived quietly on their farm, tending cattle, planting crops, and navigating the precarious balance of frontier life. Yet beneath the veneer of pastoral routine, a shadow lingered, a tension in whispered conversations, a glint of fear in the eyes of children, and a sense of something unspoken that pressed on the household like an invisible weight. It began subtly, with a small quarrel over provisions. Mr. Samuel Smith, a stern man of 40, and his wife Margaret, exchanged harsh words that cut deeper than usual. Their children, Anne and Thomas, observed from the shadows, sensing the strain but not understanding its source. Frontier life was harsh and disputes were common, yet this household carried a peculiar heaviness. There was a pattern of despair, a quiet hopelessness that seemed to permeate the walls of their cabin, staining daily life with an almost imperceptible dread. The first truly unsettling moment occurred late one evening when neighbors noticed smoke curling from the cabin's chimney far too late at night. Lanterns swung in the wind, and a faint, acrid odor drifted through the trees, distinct from the usual smoke of hearth fires. One neighbor passing by on his way home from the mill paused near the fence, ears straining. He reported hearing muffled sounds, whispers and low irregular groans punctuated by abrupt silences. The noises were subtle yet persistent, weaving a story of quiet distress that no one dared fully interpret. Over the next few days, visitors observed strange behaviors in the family. Meals were prepared and eaten with mechanical precision, yet an air of melancholy pervaded the room. Laughter, rare and fleeting, seemed forced. At night, the children reported shadows that moved independently of lantern light, figures in the corners of the room that vanished when observed directly. Some of these accounts were dismissed as imagination, the natural fears of frontier youth. Yet there was an undercurrent of truth that even the most skeptical could not ignore. The community, small and interconnected, began to notice other anomalies. Livestock were found unusually quiet, their pens empty at odd hours. The family's neighbors recalled hearing doors creak in empty rooms, or footsteps pacing the cabin floors long after all should have retired to bed. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of mental strain, of despair that had grown beyond mere domestic quarrels. The Smiths were a private family, known for their self-reliance, but isolation often bred speculation, and fear thrives in the spaces between certainty and doubt. One evening, Anne Smith, barely 12 years old, was observed carrying a small vial from the pantry. Her movements were careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The bottle contained a clear, bitter liquid, unremarkable to the eye, yet potent and dangerous. Her mother, Margaret, followed silently, eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. The scene was ordinary in outward appearance, a family preparing a simple evening drink. Yet an observer would have noted a strange tension in every gesture, a precision that bordered on compulsion, and the way silence weighed on the room as though the air itself were saturated with foreboding. Jacob Miller, a local trader who occasionally visited the Smith homestead, later recounted the eerie calm that pervaded the house during such evenings. Conversations were measured, movements deliberate, and a pervasive stillness seemed to press upon the visitors, dulling their senses and heightening their awareness of subtle anomalies. The air smelled faintly of bitter herbs, and shadows clung unnaturally to corners of the cabin. Miller's own recollection, written decades later, emphasizes the strange sense that the family existed in a state apart from ordinary time, ritualized, precise, and unyielding in its quiet dread. The first tragedy, though not immediately recognized as such, unfolded with subtlety. Each family member consumed a portion of the liquid, ritualized, synchronized, and complete in its deliberate execution. The act, ordinary in appearance, was the beginning of an inexorable descent. What followed was not a scene of chaos, but of silent, measured collapse. Limbs stiffened, breaths shortened, and consciousness slipped away without struggle, leaving behind a tableau that was horrifying precisely in its quietness. The surrounding land, so familiar and unthreatening by day, became a place of terror in the shadows of night. Neighbors described an oppressive atmosphere surrounding the cabin, an almost tangible heaviness that seemed to seep into the trees, the soil, and the very air. Animals avoided the area, and even passing travelers noted a sudden chill and a peculiar sense of unease when approaching the property. It was as if the land itself absorbed the anguish of the family and projected it outward, silently warning those who dared approach. In retrospect, the Smith family's story is not merely one of tragedy, but a lens into the psychological, cultural, and social pressures of frontier life in early 19th century Missouri. Isolation, limited access to medical care, harsh environmental conditions, and a lack of social support combined to create circumstances where despair could escalate unchecked. The act of drinking poison together, while horrifying, becomes comprehensible when viewed through the lens of cumulative stress, fear, and the social dynamics of a tightly bound household under constant pressure. Yet, even with rational explanations, the events retain a profound, lingering horror. There is a quiet terror in the synchronization of their actions, the deliberate calm, and the way human fragility intersects with choice and circumstance. The tableau left behind, the still bodies, the untouched household, the silent land, serves as a haunting reminder of the delicate balance between survival, despair, and the human capacity for tragedy. The Smith story begins with subtle unease and builds toward an inescapable inevitability. It is a narrative of ordinary people caught in extraordinary psychological and social forces, a tale where calmness and horror coexist, where ritualized behavior masks a deeper despair, and where the quiet moments are more terrifying than any sudden scream. Their homestead, now etched into local memory and historical accounts, stands as a testament to both the fragility of life and the enduring power of fear, isolation, and human vulnerability. Missouri in 1835 was a land of transition and tension, a frontier state straddling the line between established settlements and untamed wilderness. The population consisted of farmers, traders, and settlers who had moved westward seeking land, opportunity, and a fresh start. Communities were sparse, connected by dirt roads and river routes, and daily life was dictated by the rhythms of agriculture, the demands of survival, and the precarious balance between neighbors who were both allies and competitors. The Smith family, like many others, relied on self-sufficiency, tending livestock, cultivating crops, and maintaining a homestead largely isolated from formal infrastructure. Life on the Missouri frontier was harsh and unforgiving. Winters brought biting cold and heavy snowfall, often cutting families off from neighbors for days or weeks. Summers were sweltering, and droughts could devastate crops and livestock. Food preservation was a constant concern, relying on root cellars, smokehouses, and salting methods. Medical care was rudimentary. Physicians were few and far between, and even those with training often lacked the tools, medicines, or knowledge to treat more than the most basic ailments. Illnesses that today would be considered minor could become fatal, and mental strain often went unrecognized, unaddressed, and unmitigated. Socially, frontier life was structured around community and family ties, but isolation left gaps in support. Neighbors might assist during harvest or share labor in times of need. Yet households like the Smiths often faced long stretches without contact. Communication was slow and unreliable. Letters could take weeks to arrive, and news of illness, death, or misfortune often traveled by word of mouth. In such a context, fears, rational or otherwise, could grow unchecked, reinforced by superstition, observation, and the absence of outside verification. Culturally, Missouri was a crossroads of European immigrant traditions, Native American influence, and evolving American frontier norms. Belief in omens, spiritual forces, and supernatural causality remained strong, particularly in rural areas. Communities interpreted misfortune, illness, and sudden death through both religious and folkloric lenses. Ministers, elders, and local healers wielded social authority, providing guidance, comfort, or explanation, often blending observation with interpretation steeped in moral or spiritual frameworks. These perspectives shaped daily behavior, influencing how families approached danger, illness, and internal conflict. The frontier environment also imposed psychological strain. Families were responsible for not only subsistence farming but also for protecting themselves from natural hazards, such as predators, harsh weather, and disease. Children grew up with early exposure to mortality, witnessing accidents, illness, and death frequently. Mental health, as we understand it today, was largely unacknowledged. Stress, depression, and despair were often normalized or interpreted through spiritual frameworks. The Smith family's growing tension, despair, and ultimate actions can be contextualized within this environment of isolation, high-stakes survival, and social pressure. Agricultural life required constant labor and meticulous planning. Crops were vulnerable to pests, droughts, and storms, while livestock demanded daily attention. The success of a family farm often determined social standing and economic viability. Failures were not simply financial. They threatened food security, community reputation, and the family's very survival. Such stressors, compounded by limited outlets for emotional support, created conditions where despair could fester unnoticed until it manifested in tragic decisions. Religious and moral frameworks also influenced the psychological landscape. Frontier communities placed great emphasis on moral rectitude, piety, and the observance of social norms. Deviations from expected behavior were noted and sometimes judged harshly, reinforcing a culture of internalized scrutiny. Families were encouraged to maintain harmony, resolve conflicts privately, and uphold the image of order and respectability. When tension accumulated beyond these socially sanctioned outlets, it could manifest in extreme or hidden behaviors, leaving outward appearances of calm, while inner turmoil went unnoticed. Scientific knowledge and access to education were limited. Understanding of toxic substances, mental health, and physiological processes was rudimentary. Poisons such as arsenic, strychnine, or herbal toxins were sometimes used intentionally or accidentally, yet their effects were poorly documented and often mystified observers. In cases of self-harm or familial tragedy, medical explanations were secondary to moral, spiritual, or social interpretations. Communities relied on anecdotal knowledge, inherited wisdom, and observational experience, creating a framework in which mysterious deaths or illness could easily be interpreted as signs, omens, or moral lessons. In Missouri's frontier towns, small populations meant that tragedies resonated widely. News of a family's misfortune traveled quickly through neighboring homesteads, influencing perceptions of danger, morality, and supernatural influence. The Smith family's isolation intensified the impact of their actions, as there were few witnesses, few intermediaries, and little recourse for intervention. The combination of geographic, social, and psychological isolation created fertile ground for despair to escalate unnoticed, allowing small tensions to grow into devastating consequences. The historical context also illuminates why the family's tragedy, drinking poison together, could occur and leave such an indelible mark. Daily life demanded resilience, discipline, and careful management of both material and social resources. Emotional strain, compounded by isolation and lack of external support, could magnify feelings of hopelessness. Frontier norms emphasized self-reliance, stoicism, and private resolution of problems, potentially discouraging the family from seeking help or sharing distress. When despair reached its peak, action, however extreme, became both comprehensible and terrifyingly plausible. Viewed through this lens, the Smith family's fate is entwined with the environmental, social, and psychological pressures of early 19th century Missouri. Their story is not merely an isolated tragedy, but a reflection of frontier life, where isolation, hardship, and the limits of knowledge intersected to create conditions in which despair could manifest in unimaginable ways. The homestead, the fields, the surrounding forest, all ordinary by day, became the setting for extraordinary human suffering, a microcosm of the challenges, fears, and vulnerabilities of life on the American frontier. The first sign that something irreversible was taking shape in the Smith household was subtle, yet unmistakable. Early one morning, Margaret Smith was seen moving through the kitchen with a measured precision that seemed almost ritualistic. She carried a small bottle, its contents unknown to neighbors, but the careful manner in which she handled it suggested a significance beyond ordinary domestic use. Samuel Smith, her husband, appeared equally composed, assisting without words, his gestures deliberate and almost ceremonial. Their children, Anne and Thomas, followed suit, a quiet obedience etched into every movement. There was no panic, no argument, only a coordinated, almost hypnotic calm that heightened the sense of unease among those who observed from a distance. As the family gathered around the table for breakfast, the tension in the room was palpable. Each member poured the bitter liquid into small cups, their motions synchronized, deliberate, and eerily calm. The neighbors, watching through gaps in the fence, described the scene as strangely silent, as if the normal sounds of a household, conversation, clinking dishes, the shuffling of feet, had been muted by an invisible presence. When the cups were raised in unison, the ritual's full implication remained unseen, yet the air carried a weight of inevitability, a silent prelude to tragedy. Minutes passed after the first sips, and the subtle changes became noticeable. Margaret's hand trembled imperceptibly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she blinked against a sudden lightheadedness. Samuel shifted in his chair, a faint pallor spreading across his face. The children's movements slowed, their gazes unfocused, yet none resisted. There was a quiet acknowledgement, almost unspoken, that the course was set, and resistance was not considered. Observers later noted that the stillness of the house contrasted sharply with the inner turmoil now unfolding, a tension that hovered like a specter over the table. Soon, the physiological effects became undeniable. Samuel leaned back, a sudden pallor overtaking his previously steady complexion. Anne's small hand clutched the edge of the table as a wave of nausea swept over her. Thomas, barely able to comprehend the changes, looked to his parents for guidance, finding only a mirrored expression of discomfort and grim determination. Margaret, despite her own growing weakness, continued to maintain composure, guiding her family through each moment with quiet, unsettling resolve. The coordinated calm of the household rendered the scene more terrifying than any outburst of panic could have been. Neighbors attempted intervention, though their approach was cautious. One local, Mr. Hargrove, peeked through a window and saw the family in a tableau of slow-motion collapse. Fear and disbelief gripped him. He knocked on the door, calling out, but the responses were muted and incomprehensible. By the time he entered, the full extent of the tragedy was manifesting. Samuel's limbs had grown heavy, Anne and Thomas's eyes glazed, and Margaret's voice, when she spoke, was faint, almost ethereal. The silence that had enveloped the household now contained the weight of irreversible consequence, a quiet horror that defied immediate comprehension. The physical manifestations of poisoning were grotesque in their subtlety. Skin took on a waxen hue, pulses slowed, and the normal rhythm of breathing became irregular. The family remained upright in their chairs, an image of eerie dignity, as though their bodies were resisting gravity itself. Even as neighbors attempted to summon aid, the psychological weight of the scene was overwhelming. Each movement, each gasp for air, amplified the pervasive dread. Observers described feeling a creeping paralysis in their own limbs, as if the atmosphere of despair radiated beyond the cabin walls and infected all who dared approach. Attempts to administer remedies only heightened the tension. Water was offered, cloths pressed to foreheads, and rudimentary herbal antidotes applied, but the poison's effects were swift and unrelenting. Thomas and Anne's small hands grasped at nothing, twitching as consciousness faded, while Margaret held herself upright with a quiet, stoic determination. Samuel's attempts to speak were reduced to incomprehensible murmurs. The family's unity in collapse, the synchronous decline, and the absence of panic created a scene that witnesses later described as both mesmerizing and horrifying, a study in human fragility and the inexorable progress of chemical influence on the body. As the hours passed, the interior of the cabin became a chamber of silent horror. The normal rhythms of domestic life, footsteps, the clatter of utensils, the murmur of conversation, had vanished. In their place was an almost supernatural stillness, punctuated only by shallow, irregular breaths and faint groans. The house, once a place of daily labor and familial warmth, had transformed into a theater of slow, inevitable mortality. Shadows lengthened unnaturally across the floorboards, cast by flickering lanterns and diffuse sunlight filtering through the windows, creating a chiaroscuro of terror that imprinted itself indelibly in the memories of witnesses. By midday, the physical consequences were complete. The family had collapsed fully into unconsciousness, their forms rigid in places, slack in others. Neighboring families, having observed the slow unfolding of tragedy, struggled to comprehend the scale and nature of the event. The horror was compounded by the stillness. No frantic cries, no struggle, only a quiet tableau of life suspended at the precipice of death. Even the animals, horses in the barn, chickens in the yard, seemed to sense the shift, remaining unusually quiet, heads bowed, as if acknowledging the gravity of human suffering. Throughout the day, a sense of pervasive dread persisted. Local children dared not approach, elders whispered prayers, and the wind carried an unusual stillness through the trees surrounding the homestead. Every observer, whether near or distant, reported a subtle, lingering unease, a psychic imprint of the household's tragedy that extended beyond the immediate physical space. In this way, the incident became not merely a medical horror, but a social and psychological event, demonstrating the profound interaction between environment, human behavior, and communal perception of mortality. The aftermath of the poisoning also highlighted early 19th century limitations in medical understanding. Physicians called to the scene could only record observations of physical deterioration, pallor, irregular heartbeat, respiratory difficulty, and eventual unconsciousness. No knowledge of the precise chemical properties or appropriate antidotes existed locally, and intervention, even if attempted promptly, was insufficient to reverse the effects. The convergence of medical ignorance, social isolation, and psychological strain created conditions in which tragedy was not only possible but perhaps inevitable. In this series of events, the horror lies not in spectacle or violence, but in deliberate calm, in measured and synchronous collapse, and in the eerie silence that accompanied the act. The Smith family's descent demonstrates the terrifying intersection of human vulnerability, environmental pressures, chemical influence, and social isolation. It is a narrative where quiet desperation, societal context, and physiological reality converge to create a tragedy both comprehensible and profoundly unsettling. News of the Smith family's tragic demise spread swiftly through the surrounding Missouri settlements. In small frontier communities, word traveled by foot, horseback, and whispered conversations, and the event became the subject of both fear and morbid fascination. Neighbors who had occasionally observed the family's strange routines expressed shock that the quiet household, seemingly ordinary, could have succumbed so completely to despair and poison. The suddenness and finality of the incident disrupted the social fabric, leaving communities grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Family members and close relatives were among the first to arrive at the homestead. The scene, frozen in quiet horror, left a deep psychological imprint. The children's grandparents, distant cousins, and aunts and uncles struggled to comprehend the simultaneous collapse of all family members. The precise synchronized nature of the act, parents and children participating together, added a layer of incomprehensible coordination that magnified emotional distress. Mourning was not only for the lives lost, but also for the eerie method of their passing, a ritualistic calm that seemed alien, yet deeply human in its quiet desperation. Medical professionals were called to document and attempt interventions, though in 1835 the understanding of toxicology and poisoning was rudimentary. Physicians recorded pallor, slow or irregular heartbeat, and respiratory distress, but lacked knowledge of effective antidotes or treatments. Observations were often descriptive rather than diagnostic, noting the precise sequence of collapse and the apparent absence of struggle or convulsions typical in other poisoning cases. While medical reasoning provided some framework, it failed to fully explain the psychological and environmental factors contributing to the tragedy, leaving a sense of mystery intertwined with practical observation. Religious authorities interpreted the event through moral and spiritual lenses. Ministers and pastors, addressing congregations, emphasized human frailty, the dangers of despair, and the importance of faith and divine guidance. Sermons highlighted the fragility of life on the frontier, cautioning against the isolation and emotional strain that could lead to despair. Spiritual interpretations offered both comfort and warning. Comfort in framing the deaths within a moral and divine context, and warning as a lesson to other families about the potential consequences of unaddressed sorrow and desolation. Local neighbors contributed eyewitness accounts and observations that mixed factual description with folklore. Some noted peculiar behaviors in the Smith household prior to the tragedy, late-night movements, whispered arguments, or the quiet, almost mechanical demeanor during mealtimes. Others emphasized strange atmospheric conditions, odd silences in the woods, the behavior of animals, or subtle shifts in wind and light near the homestead. These anecdotes, when compiled, created a narrative that blurred lines between objective observation and interpretive storytelling, demonstrating the interplay of psychology, environment, and cultural perception in shaping communal understanding of tragedy. Newspapers and pamphlets of the period amplified the event, blending reportage with moral and sensational commentary. Headlines recounted the deaths as both cautionary tale and curiosity. The Smith family's silent demise and tragedy at the Missouri homestead captured public attention, fueling debate over causation and interpretation. Letters to editors, often anonymous, reflected divisions in public sentiment. Some readers demanded investigation into the poison's source, while others attributed the deaths to spiritual malaise or familial despair. These publications helped cement the event in regional memory, ensuring the incident would not fade into obscurity despite the rural isolation of the community. Psychological interpretations, nascent at the time, began to emerge through observation and anecdotal report. Residents recognized patterns of isolation-induced stress, cumulative anxiety, and social pressures that may have contributed to the family's decision. Observers noted the children's early exposure to domestic tension, parental rigidity, and lack of emotional outlets as contributing factors to vulnerability and despair. While terminology and formal frameworks were not available in 1835, communal intuition highlighted the interplay between environment, upbringing, and psychological strain, reflecting an early recognition of what modern psychology would later explore as social and familial determinants of mental health. The community's social response also included practical measures. Neighboring families increased vigilance, offered mutual support, and established routines to prevent similar occurrences. Townsfolk monitored supplies, shared medical knowledge, and reinforced moral teachings to guide families through emotional stress. While these interventions were often informal and based on observation rather than structured scientific understanding, they reflected an emergent recognition of the importance of social cohesion and preventative oversight in rural frontier communities. The incident's resonance extended beyond immediate grief. Discussions in town gatherings often pondered the interplay of fate, environment, and human agency. Could such despair arise naturally, or was there moral or spiritual causation? Did the family act with full autonomy, or were they compelled by unseen forces of social and psychological pressure? These questions were debated in hushed tones in kitchens, at church meetings, and during visits between households, embedding the Smith family's tragedy in both social consciousness and local folklore. Even decades later, the memory of the family's demise influenced social norms and cautionary advice. Families used the story as both warning and lesson, the importance of addressing emotional strain, fostering communication, and maintaining social support. The narrative persisted in both oral tradition and early written accounts, demonstrating how a single family's tragedy could shape communal understanding of psychological vulnerability, environmental pressures, and moral reflection for generations. Ultimately, the public reaction to the Smith family tragedy exemplifies the multifaceted responses to extreme events in frontier communities. A mix of grief, moral reasoning, psychological interpretation, and practical adjustment. It highlights the role of observation, storytelling, and cultural framework in shaping communal perception, and illustrates the enduring tension between rational explanation and human fascination with the mysterious and the tragic. The intersection of medical observation, social interpretation, and spiritual reflection created a layered understanding that continues to inform historical perspectives on despair, family dynamics, and the human response to extreme stress in isolated environments. The culmination of the Smith family's tragedy unfolded in a manner both deliberate and chilling. By mid-afternoon, the effects of the poison had progressed to an undeniable severity. The family, seated around their modest wooden table, exhibited a coordinated decline that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Samuel's hands, once steady in labor and domestic duty, now trembled uncontrollably. Margaret, despite visible weakness, maintained a composure that made the scene eerily calm, guiding her children through each subtle step with quiet determination. Anne and Thomas, young and unaware of the full consequence, mirrored their parents' actions, a reflection of obedience interwoven with innocence. From the neighboring yard, Mr. Hargrove and other townsfolk observed through gaps in the fence, unable to intervene effectively. Their horror was compounded by the synchronous and ritualistic nature of the family's actions. There were no cries of panic, no frantic struggle, only measured deliberate gestures as the liquid took hold. The household, usually filled with the ordinary sounds of frontier life, was enveloped in a heavy silence, broken only by shallow breaths and occasional murmurs. Every observer noted the surreal calm, the almost hypnotic progression toward inevitable collapse. As the poison spread through their bodies, each symptom emerged in haunting succession. Samuel's face lost color rapidly, his pulse slowing with each passing moment. Margaret's eyes flickered, and the subtle quiver of her lips betrayed the internal struggle to maintain composure. Anne clutched at the table edge as dizziness overcame her, while Thomas swayed slightly, his small frame straining to stay upright. The scene was one of inexorable descent, a horrifying study in physiological deterioration observed in real time, made all the more terrifying by the family's unified acceptance of their fate. Neighbors who had attempted to intervene were powerless to halt the process. Efforts to pour water, administer herbal remedies, or shake them from stupor were met with faint resistance at most. The poison acted methodically, a silent, invisible agent transforming vitality into stillness. The observer's own emotional responses intensified the horror. Fear, helplessness, and disbelief collided in a tangible atmosphere that seemed to press upon the cabin itself. Every movement within the household, every shallow breath, was magnified by the psychological weight of witnessing such inevitable decline. The house, ordinary in construction and appearance, became a chamber of suspended life. Shadows from flickering lanterns and sunlight streaming through small windows painted the walls with distorted shapes, lending a theatrical and grotesque quality to the unfolding scene. Dust motes hung in the air, illuminated like spectral witnesses to the tragedy. The combination of light, stillness, and human suffering created a tableau so precise and controlled that it felt almost ritualistic, amplifying the psychological impact on those present. By late afternoon, consciousness ebbed further from each family member. Samuel slumped forward slightly, his head resting on the table, eyes half-lidded but still glimmering with a faint recognition of surroundings. Margaret adjusted her children's seating subtly, ensuring they were upright even as their limbs grew heavy and unresponsive. Anne's small body leaned into her mother, seeking reassurance, while Thomas attempted to stand, faltering against the invisible pull of mortality. The household existed in a liminal space between life and death, a terrifyingly calm suspension that magnified the observer's dread. The psychological effect on witnesses was profound. Observers reported a suffocating weight in the air, a visceral awareness of mortality so immediate and personal that it seemed to radiate outward from the family itself. Even those familiar with frontier hardships recognized the scene as extraordinary, surpassing normal comprehension of illness or accident. The synchronized decline, the absence of struggle, and the eerie calm transformed the event into a spectacle of horror that was both naturalistic and almost surreal. As the afternoon waned, subtle environmental changes accentuated the drama. A sudden stillness in the surrounding woods, a quiet wind lifting dust without sound, and the distant caw of a lone crow all contributed to the atmosphere. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on walls and floors, exaggerating the skeletal forms of the family as they moved through the final stages of poisoning. Time seemed suspended, each second stretching as the poison completed its relentless course. Medical understanding at the time offered little comfort. Physicians called to examine the family could only document the physiological progression: pallor, slowed pulse, labored breathing, and eventual unresponsiveness. No antidote, no intervention could alter the inevitable. The convergence of chemical action, human fragility, and psychological resignation created a tableau that defied easy interpretation, both horrifyingly real and suffused with an almost supernatural calm. By early evening, the family lay still, each member a witness to the inevitability they had embraced together. The observers, unable to fully comprehend or intervene, were left in a state of shock and profound unease. The house, once alive with ordinary domestic activity, had transformed into a mausoleum of quiet horror, an enduring testament to the fragility of life, the weight of despair, and the complex interplay of human choice, environment, and circumstance. Even after the final breaths, the scene's psychological imprint persisted. Shadows lingered unnaturally, dust hung in the air, and the silence became a presence itself, oppressive, haunting, and almost sentient. Witnesses reported a lingering sense of observation, as though the family's tragic action had left a residue, a subtle awareness imprinted on the surrounding space that would persist long after the event. The climax, marked by calm, inevitability, and a quiet intensity, became the defining moment of the Smith family story, a study in coordinated despair, physiological decline, and human vulnerability rendered in stark, unforgettable detail. In the weeks and months following the Smith family's tragic demise, the Missouri homestead remained a place of quiet terror. Neighbors approached with caution, wary of both the physical space and the lingering psychological weight. Even the land seemed affected. The fields grew unevenly, shadows lingered longer in the corners of the woods, and animals avoided the property as if sensing the residual despair that had seeped into the soil. Locals spoke in hushed tones of the homestead, passing it by on errands or river trips, the memory of synchronized death creating a narrative that intertwined fear, respect, and morbid fascination. Survivors from the extended family were left with deep emotional scars. Those who had once interacted with the Smiths carried the images of the calm yet tragic collapse in their minds, unable to forget the precise, ritualized manner in which life had ebbed. Psychologists today might interpret these reactions as early forms of trauma, compounded by isolation and the communal nature of frontier life. At the time, however, the community relied on spiritual guidance and folklore to process grief. Ministers preached about despair, morality, and human fragility, framing the event as both a cautionary tale and a divine mystery beyond mortal comprehension. The story of the Smith family became a point of social and moral reflection. Scholars, when studying the region decades later, highlighted how isolation, environmental stress, and limited knowledge could amplify despair to fatal levels. The house itself, though abandoned, was examined by curious visitors and later by historians seeking to document the physical context of the tragedy. Each observation added layers to the understanding of human behavior under extreme conditions. The intersection of mental strain, social pressure, and environmental hardship. Speculation about the underlying cause persisted. Some argued that it was despair so profound that it drove the family to a collective choice, an intentional and chilling act of unity in death. Others pointed to the effects of toxins, environmental conditions, or latent illness as contributing factors. While chemical analysis and medical intervention would have been primitive in 1835, the combination of psychological vulnerability, isolation, and cultural pressures created circumstances in which the act could occur almost inevitably. The truth, as often happens with frontier tragedies, remains partially obscured, leaving room for both rational interpretation and dark imagination. Stories and whispers continued to circulate in the local area. The homestead became an emblem of caution and reflection, a symbol of the dangers of isolation, the importance of social connection, and the fragile line between resilience and despair. Travelers recounted a sense of unease when passing the property, describing subtle atmospheric changes, shadows seeming to shift independently, gusts of wind without apparent source, a heaviness in the air that could not be explained by ordinary observation. In this way, the Smith family's tragedy entered the realm of legend, blurring the line between historical event and haunted memory. Cultural reflection on the incident highlighted the intersection of human behavior, societal norms, and frontier life. Communities used the story to reinforce social bonds, encourage vigilance against emotional despair, and emphasize the need for communal support in a harsh environment. Clergy and community leaders referenced the tragedy in sermons and gatherings, framing the deaths as both moral and cautionary lessons. Meanwhile, historians and folklorists examined the case as an illustration of how social, environmental, and psychological pressures could converge with devastating consequences. Even decades later, the Smith homestead remained a subject of curiosity and fear. Visitors who sought to explore the site often reported feelings of unease, vertigo, or subtle auditory and visual anomalies. The psychological imprint of collective trauma appeared to persist in the land itself, reinforcing the narrative that the house and the event that occurred within it was more than a physical tragedy. It was an enduring locus of human vulnerability, memory, and mystery. In reflecting on the Smith family, the intersection of despair, choice, and environment becomes apparent. The deliberate calm with which they acted, the synchronized nature of their decline, and the eerie precision of their final moments illustrate both the depth of human psychological complexity and the powerful effects of isolation and environmental stress. The tragedy serves as a reminder that human suffering is often interwoven with circumstance, culture, and perception, creating events that are simultaneously understandable and profoundly unsettling. Ultimately, the haunted memory of the Smith homestead stands as a testament to both human fragility and the enduring power of narrative. The story resonates across time, offering reflection on psychological vulnerability, familial dynamics, and the consequences of despair. It is a narrative that leaves more questions than answers. What compels a family to such a coordinated act? How does isolation amplify emotional and psychological strain? Can human behavior, even under extreme stress, be fully predicted or understood? The story of the Smith family concludes not with resolution, but with reflection. The homestead, the land, and the surrounding forests remain silent witnesses, preserving the memory of a tragedy that continues to provoke thought, fear, and speculation. Their fate, while fully recorded in the historical annals, retains a haunting quality, a reminder that even in apparent calm, profound darkness can reside. The echoes of that summer in 1835 persist, an enduring narrative of despair, unity, and death, and the complex, often incomprehensible forces that shape human behavior in extreme circumstances.